Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 top tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode. Adopted at birth, Edward de Gangi was born and raised in New York City. Although he knew for most of his life that he was adopted, it wasn't until he approached his 70th birthday that he began the search for the identity of his mother. His journey and the many surprising discoveries he made as he searched are recounted in his memoir, The Gift Best Given. I had a lovely conversation with Edward about his journey, how he started the research for his birth mother, where it led him, the surprising places that it led him indeed, and how he discovered that in fact she was a very successful ice dancer, not an ice skater, an ice dancer in the 1940s. She travelled around the world with her dance troupe, was part of the Ice Follies, and had a very exciting life. And Edward recounts this life intermingled with his own search for his mother and, of course, the details of her life. So it is a love story, there is drama, and it is all set with the backdrop of the glamorous 1940s America. So, listen to how he got started and how he conducted his research, which you'll find useful if you are also thinking about writing a memoir. Edward, thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to learning more about you and, of course, your birth mother. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join you.
A pleasure. So I always love to start by asking my guests, tell us about your journey to writing specifically.
Well, I guess my journey to writing is kind of a prolonged one, even though this memoir is my first full-length book. My first published piece of writing was my high school yearbook. And a piece of nonfiction with a little bit of creativity added to it. Through my professional career, I was called on to write a great deal, but that was all business writing. And I managed inbound telephone call centers. So I had employee groups that ranged from 50 people to 1,500 people.
Oh, wow.
And there was always the need to communicate, sometimes not terribly good news. I was in the airline industry, I was in the communications industry, and I was in the healthcare industry. And, and there's always something that impacted our employees. And, so there's always the opportunity to write, to communicate, to make sure everyone received the same message. Mm-hmm. And, some of my employees would probably tell you some of that writing was fairly creative as well, because, sometimes you're trying to put the best spin on a bad story.
Yeah. So it's amazing, isn't it, that even though it's considered business writing, there's still a story, there's still information to convey, that you've still got to communicate in a clear way, which is exactly what we have to do in fiction writing or creative non-fiction as well. So there's
absolutely
definitely an overlap. But it wasn't until you were approaching your 70th birthday, I believe, that you started thinking about this memoir or started writing this memoir, The Gift Best Given, which was about your search for the identity of your birth mother. And although you'd always known that you were adopted, it wasn't until you got to that age that you decided you wanted to do that search. And so, there's always that question, well, what prompted you? What was the drive? What was the call that even after all this time, you still wanted to find out about your birth mother?
Well, as you said, I knew pretty much all my life that I had been adopted, even though it was not a subject that my adoptive parents addressed. I found that somewhat by accident. And my approach was, if they were not talking about it, I guess it was something I shouldn't ask about.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very fortunate in that I had as good a childhood as anybody could hope for, whether they were naturally born or they were adopted. So I had no great impetus to go and find out what the other side of that story was.
Mm-hmm.
But finally, there were a small handful of minor triggering events, and first is DNA testing has gotten very popular,
Mm-hmm.
and Ancestry.com here in the U.S. advertises just like crazy. So I knew that there were options there to do some research.
Mm-hmm.
There were some television shows at the time about long lost families and finding your roots,
Mm-hmm.
and that was always curious. And then on the literary side, I had read a book, and I was actually on my third reading when I finally made the
Oh.
decision to move forward. A book by a gentleman by the name of Daniel Mendelsohn, and he is a professor. He is also a classicist. He's very, very in tune with the Greek tragedies and classic literature. But he came from a family that came out of the Holocaust many years before, and somewhere in the early 2000s, triggered somewhat like I was, I suppose. He decided he needed to know what had happened to 6 members of his family
Mm.
that had remained in Germany or in Eastern Europe. Actually, they were in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. Ah.
And he knew in general terms that they perished in the Holocaust, but that was not what he was looking for. He wanted the specifics.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote a wonderful book called The Lost, The Search for 6 of 6 Million. And yeah, he was very fortunate that, or more fortunate than most of us are, and that based on his track record with literature, he got a substantial advance that let him spend 2 years traveling the world searching for these answers.
Oh, wow.
And I've mentioned the book, his book in my book. It's a story. It's once a history story, a mystery, and also a little bit of an introduction to the Old Testament. He interleaves his story with pieces of the Old Testament.
Okay.
And I was just so enraptured with it. I started thinking, gee, maybe I could do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, I could not afford to travel the world. But I decided I would dig in.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very fortunate in that my adoption at the time of my birth had been privately arranged. There was paperwork that was attendant to that adoption, and my adoptive parents had kept a copy of that paperwork.
Well, that's lucky.
And it had an unknown name on it, which I later deduced had to be my birth mother's name,
Mm-hmm.
saying that she was willing to surrender a child. And with that name in hand, I began the journey.
Oh, wow. Wow. So just to take a step back for a moment, the Daniel
Sure.
Mendelsohn book, you mentioned that it was on your third reading that you thought, oh, maybe I could do this too. What was it about? What was that moment, do you think? Or what was it he said in that book or was describing in that book that was the moment that switch, you said, fine, okay, I'm going to do it now? Can you remember?
Well, I don't think there was any one particular piece. It was just so dense with information and the details of his search.
Mm-hmm.
And it also resonated with me because my adoptive mother's family came from Ukraine.
Right.
And I thought, okay, there's some connection there. I knew that my adoptive mother's family was a Christian family. Mendelssohn's was obviously a Jewish family. But by the same token, they came from pretty much the same place.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of got my juices going. Because actually, when I first started to look, I looked for my adoptive family first.
Ah.
And when I saw just how easy it might be, and I say that cautiously might, I decided to change course and said, you've never really given thought to what your biological roots were. This may be the time, and this may be the opportunity. And things just started to pour out from that point.
Yes, technology has made a huge difference. I've done a lot of family history myself, and it's for many of us so much easier now that it's all digitized. But I just want to pick up on the point for our listeners, because one of the things I do talk about a lot is that everybody's story needs to be told, whether it be their own memoir type story or whether it be a fiction story. Everybody deserves to tell their story, and it's very important. And we often think we've got to have like a big story to have an impact in the world, but often it's those small, personal, specific and unique stories that really touch other people and inspire other people. So Daniel Mendelsohn's story, it was about his family, possibly of no interest to anybody else because it was about his family, and yet it's in the specifics of his search and what he uncovered that then has led you to make your discovery, and then by dint of that, your memoir will now encourage someone else to go on and find their story and encourage them. I just think it's a lovely example of that, of how we're all connected, all of our stories need to be shared, and you will find someone to impact with whatever story you have. So I thought that was just worth mentioning for our listeners there. But
I think it's a good point. I think, as you said, it will be impactful someplace, somewhere down the line. At this point, my son knows the story, is kind of casual about, does he think it's anything special or not? But I suspect someplace down the line, there will be a grandchild or a great-grandchild who will ask a question, and there'll be some recorded history at that point. And, looking back, I think one of my disappointments, and I don't have many disappointments in life, is that, I didn't ask more questions when the people who could answer them were here.
Yeah.
And, at my age now, most of those people are long gone. And I sit here now with questions. Best guess now as to what the answer really was.
I hear that a lot from memoirists, and, that kind of, if only I'd asked when they were here. But even I honestly, it's not just your own descendants who will benefit. There are many war babies out there, yes, and who might be wondering, and this might give them, your book might give them the courage to go out and find their own story as well. So, but so to do that, to encourage them, can you share with us what research you did, and that someone else may be able to try as well?
Well, there's a good deal of research that was involved in sussing out the story. The first was the obvious. I plugged my birth mother's name into Ancestry.com and sat back. I really didn't know what I would find. And when I pressed that enter button, there were a couple of pages of listings of information. Some of it was fairly typical things, census documents, things such as that. But the first document that I chose to click on was an immigration certificate or an application for a visa traveling from Miami, Florida, here in the States, to Rio de Janeiro.
Ooh.
And I picked that one because it was dated only 8 months after I was born. And it just perplexed me. I said, okay, where could this woman be going? And my assumption had always been, it had been a high school girl who accidentally got pregnant, had to give up a baby, and then moved on with her life. And this indicated something else. And, I opened that up, and for the first time, I saw a picture of my birth mother.
Oh, wow. That must have been a shock.
It was a bit of a shock. I looked at it, and the first thing I did was I looked one side and the other to see if anyone else was looking, and no reason anyone should have cared. But yeah, it was rather startling to all of a sudden be face to face with a woman who had brought me into the world.
Yeah, very emotional, I imagine. Like, visceral.
It was, and the piece that was a bit confusing was, it was written in Portuguese, but all of the blanks were filled in English, so that was okay. But there was a piece that asked for what her occupation was, her profisseo, and it listed her as an artista. And that was the piece that threw a curveball for some time because I didn't know what sort of artista. And I did lots of searching, and my next step was I went onto Google, which seems to be everybody's answer to everything when you need an answer. And I put in her name and really did not find very much. I found one other person with the same name, which started to concern me because she was a little bit older. I said, but that could be my mother too. So that gave me some pause, but I eventually found a copy of her marriage certificate. She got married 7 years after I was born. Hers was an accidental pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
She eventually did marry. So when I found the marriage certificate, it had her maiden name on it. In the interim,
key, isn't it?
Yeah, and the interim, she had adopted a stage name, which tied to her being an artista.
Uh-huh.
And then the certificate showed what her husband's name was, and it listed them both as performers.
Oh, intriguing.
So it got me a little bit closer. And I then went back to Google and I put in her maiden name, performer. Nothing came up. I put in her stage name, performer, and the stage name, oddly enough, appeared on the on the marriage certificate, because I think that became her identity.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden I found a page which was online, courtesy of an antiques dealer in South Carolina, and she had been to an auction of antiques, and she wrote about the folk art pieces that she had purchased, and they had been manufactured by my birth mother and her new husband after they retired from being ice skaters.
Oh, wow.
They had both been performers in the big ice shows of the 1940s and the 1950s, and then went into the process afterwards, after their retirement, of manufacturing props that were used for the ice shows, as well as other theatrical and commercial events.
Oh, wow. So she was ever the entrepreneur, ever the
Very
businesswoman.
much so. Very much so.
Oh, exciting.
Yes.
So Ancestry and Google are really good ways to start. And I think, you've mentioned there that you did a few different searches, and that can often be a sort of, because even with the unusual surname, not everything always comes up, and you do have to try a few things and a few combinations. Certainly that's been my own experience as well, just to see if there's any nicknames or shortenings of names and what people go by. So what were the sort of main obstacles you found to finding your family's kind of background and history? Was it that there were a lot of people with the same surname, or just that there weren't that many records? Because it was during the war, was anything classified? What kind of obstacles?
No, I was born after World War II. This was 1948, so it was 3-4 years afterwards. There were at the time, I was born in New York City. Until a couple of years ago, all birth records in New York were sealed, all adoption records. So you could file for non-identifying information, which I did, and I can tell you that non-identifying was exactly what it said. There was just nothing of help there. It did not give my mother's name. It did not give my father's name. It listed her as an abandoned housewife, and which was not the story. And so that was not help. I was actually very fortunate in that, because she had a public persona, she had risen to celebrity status in her field, that there was a good deal of information out there when I finally started to search for it.
Brilliant.
And I did find that she and her husband had moved to Georgia after they left the skating business. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know at that time whether or not my birth mother was even still alive. I certainly hoped she was. And I don't know what her reaction would have been had she been alive. But I started searching, and you can find phone directories and address directories, and I found one, and the letter I hand wrote letters. I thought something that was handwritten would look honest and sincere, and not that had any trickery or criminal value to it. And I sent a letter and saying, you don't know me, or maybe you do know me, but I'm your son. And it was returned as an unknown address.
Okay. Oh, it's like a novel in itself, isn't it? It's the ups and downs, the emotional turmoil that goes with it, the anticipation.
It was.
And did you have support from your family and friends in your search for your birth mother?
Well, I had two pieces of support, which I thought were important. First was my wife, she was urging me from much earlier on than where I began to search, to research. Mm-hmm. If nothing else, do a DNA test and find out what my ethnicity was. Mm-hmm. If I wanted to go deeper, to go and do some of that searching. And if I needed to hire a private detective in Georgia to find out who my mother was or where she was, to go ahead and do that. The other piece of support I had was a very good friend who I'd sit many mornings during the week at a local market here and have coffee with, and who had written several books of his own. And as I was telling him about my search, he said, you should really be writing this down. And I didn't think there was a lot to write down at that point. But I did begin the memoir portion of my book, which was every time I would take a step forward or take a step backwards, I'd record that and I would put it into prose and I would tell that story. Ultimately, so he was very valuable, and he's still nudging me. I had coffee with him a couple of days ago and he was saying, what are you writing now? What are you writing now? And we discuss that all the time. But my next big step forward was again another antiques dealer who had been to the same auction as that first person. And she had a blog page up. And this is after I knew my mother's performing name. And I knew that she had been an ice skater. And I put in her name followed by the word ice skater. And this blog page came up with half a dozen pictures of my birth mother, a copy of her first professional contract, and as I recall, even a copy of her middle school diploma. And
so had this is sort of sounding like perhaps this was a house clearance or something, and it's all in the same shop?
Yeah, there had been some unhappy events in my mother's later life.
Right.
And there was a need to vacate property. Okay. So those big pieces that the first antiques dealer purchased had been props that had been manufactured and they had in storage. This lady, the second antiques dealer, purchased a carton of just memorabilia, and it turned out to be promotional photographs of my mother, her first photo album, or the album where she kept her press clippings, these couple of, the contract, the diploma, a news clipping at the very bottom of the carton, which was of my birth mother before she started professional performing as a 16-year-old in a war bonds performance trying to raise money for the U.S. And so I saw that page and I reached out to the woman. I found her on Facebook and said, I'm exploring a possible relationship. And do you still have these items? And she had purchased them several years before. And I assumed if she was a dealer that she had long ago sold them. Mm-hmm. And she got back to me fairly quickly. She said, yes, we do. But I'm very busy now. Can I get back to you? And I had no choice, but I was happy to know she still had them. Wow. And, she didn't get back to me. So about a week later, I decided to drop the pretense, and I reached out to her again and said, I don't want to bother you, but the items you have belong to the woman who is my birth mother. And she called back in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And she said, this is amazing. You need to come here now.
Oh, wow.
And we live in North Carolina. She lives in Atlanta, Georgia, which is, when you get to Georgia, there's a lot of traffic. So it's the better part of a 6-hour trip, I think.
Uh-huh.
But about a week later, we drove down there, and she and her husband met with us. They brought all these items with them. And it was a very moving experience to go through and hold in my hands the items that had gone, from my mother's hands into the carton.
Mm-hmm. And
at one point I was making some notes. I was just jotting down names of other people whose pictures were in the carton. And, and the woman's husband said, what are you doing? And I explained, I said, well, if these people skated with my mother, maybe some of them are still alive and they could tell me more about her. And he just shook his head. He said, that's not necessary. He said, we brought this carton here because it belongs to you. We've just been holding it for you.
Oh, isn't that kind? That's so lovely.
Yeah, I've said this before, Emma. This journey has been filled with remarkable coincidence, and it's been filled with remarkably generous and kind people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that kindness is because that's the kind of person it appears my birth mother was.
Oh, lovely.
Anybody who I contacted who knew her had nothing but positive things to say.
Well, I want to take you just back a bit to something that you said earlier when about writing the memoir, and when your friends first suggested that you start writing it down, and you thought, oh, well, I've actually not got lots to write about. I wanted just to pick you up on that. You said, it didn't feel like there was a lot to write at that time, but then it sounds like as you started writing, then you found it got easier to write. Because one of the things when I think about, would I ever write a memoir? What would I write about? And, there's nothing, I can't think of anything that would be worth telling. But did you find, it sounds like you had that similar thought at the beginning, but then did that change as you started the writing?
It did change, and the point at which it changed is when I found out my mother had been a celebrity.
Okay. Okay.
Because my first thought was, as I said, it's a high school girl who unfortunately got pregnant, was forced to give up a child, and then went on and probably lived a valuable but, quote unquote, ordinary life.
Mm-hmm.
And when I found out that she lived a valuable but extraordinary kind of life,
mm-hmm.
I started exploring that side, both her story as well as what those ice skating shows were like at that era, and the entire ice skating community. And ice skating was a very popular thing from the late 1920s. And it still is, but it's not quite what it was back in the 40s and the 50s, when that was very high level entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
But at that point, that's where I knew I had a story to tell.
Okay. And so then how did you decide to structure this story? Did you decide to do it linearly, or did you sort of jump about a little bit? How did you decide to put it all together?
Well, my initial approach was to deal with it as two pieces. One was my search in a linear manner, and then was my mother's life from the time she left her home in 1942 to become an ice skater through the period in late 1948 when she surrendered me for adoption. So I had book one and I had book two, and they were rather discrete, neither one quite blended together. And I thought it was okay, but I thought it was a little bit bumpy the way it was. So when I gave it to my editor, she went through it and she came back and said, I have one suggestion for you, and it's a big suggestion. And her analogy was treat both of these like halves of a deck of cards and shuffle them
Ah,
and interleave them. So, it begins with, here's how I started with my story. Here's
oh,
the first thing I found out. Here's where I looked next. This is what I found out. So the book took 3 lives. The first was my search. The second was just a generic, here's what I found out about my mother. But
mhm.
then the third piece, which was unexpected, is it became very much a homage to my mother and to the strength and the focus that she took in essentially secretly managing her pregnancy, and then arranging very, very meticulously a a, a privately arranged adoption
Mhm.
with people who met the list of things she wanted for me.
Mhm.
and
Oh,
and some of that was just kind of backing into the story, and just little pieces that I would accumulate from conversations with people who I had never asked about my adoption before. As I said, I never talked about it with my parents.
mhm.
And I did finally have a conversation with a cousin who is much older than I am, and I just picked up the phone one day and said, "Okay, I'll go for it." And we made our little bit of chit chat, and then out of the blue, I said, "What do you know about my adoption?" And she had some very, very critical details
Okay.
about how my adoption took place, and
Mhm.
it just answered the final questions in the story.
Mhm.
And the my
And so is
description.
that, and so is that something you would advise anybody who's thinking about writing a memoir? Is, pick up the phone and talk to people about aspects of the story that they don't know, that you can be surprised at what other people know and how open they can be about sharing that information.
Absolutely. So if you've got questions, ask them.
Hmm.
If you don't have questions, start the conversation. And it could be that you think you know the answer. Somebody else may tell you something that you didn't know, or
Hmm.
tell you something about what you thought that's different.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it was very interesting when the book was published. I had 2 other cousins contact me almost immediately. And I said in the book that I just never knew I was adopted. And both of them called up, contacted me and said, "Gee, I'm sorry. We've known all our lives that you were adopted. My mother or my father said, don't talk about it."
Gosh, how did that make you feel then, to know that other people knew this, and but nobody wanted to talk about it? And do you know why nobody was allowed to talk about it?
Well, going back into that era in the United States, it was called the baby scoop era. And that was a adoption on both sides of that coin, whether you were giving up a child or whether you were adopting a child, was kind of an embarrassing phenomena. And I just don't think it was something anyone wanted to talk about. And it
Hmm.
was to be publicly discussed. And
Hmm.
so I'm sure that was it. It was, I think it was with good intention, probably to protect myself as well as protect my parents.
Hmm.
And when I heard that, at 70 years old, what does it matter? I think some people would be very angry that the secrets were kept from them.
Yeah.
As I said in the beginning, I had a very good life and I'm very grateful for it. So
Okay.
I had nothing to be angry about.
Oh,
I was curious, and I sort of felt bad for the 2 cousins who had been burdened with a secret for all these years.
oh,
But
that's very
they
generous. Yeah.
but they assumed that I had known, so we just no one ever talked about it. That was fine. And I cannot tell you it's that way for all adoptees, because it's not.
No, no, it's a unique experience for everybody, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So, well, congratulations on the publication
Well,
of the
thank you.
memoir. And I know that you have done a lot of events to promote it, and you've still got many more to come. Is this an aspect of the promotion and the publication side of being an author that you enjoy? Or is it something you've had to get used to?
No, I enjoy it. I tell people, I go out and they say, well, how do you do with your book event? And I tell them it's a book at a time. Some days you don't sell any books. Some days you sell a bunch.
Uh-huh.
It's the opportunity to talk with people and to interact. And I enjoy that very much. I really do. And I think it's also an opportunity to answer questions from people who, about adoption.
Mhm.
And I get a lot of people who come to me and say, gee, I'm adopted, or I gave up a child for adoption, or so-and-so gave up a child. And it, we all get a different bit of context about that experience. And I
Mhm.
think I think there's value to that.
Mhm.
If I've come away with one piece out of the entire experience, it's just a profound appreciation for what a birth mother goes through in surrendering a child.
Mhm.
I if you had asked me before I wrote this book, what I thought, you give up a child and you go on with your life. And I don't think that's the case. You go on with your life, but you never get past that experience of surrendering the child.
Mhm. Yes. Oh, so hard for all those women. Oh, so we've talked a lot about, your research, your process, how you pulled it all together. So tell us about the memoir. Tell us about your birth mother and why people should buy it.
Well, I think it's an exciting story that reads to end very smoothly. It's about 350 pages, so it is full of information. But it tells my mother's story from the time she left home as a 17-year-old in 1942. So this is in the midst of World War II.
Mhm.
She traveled from New York City alone by train to Vancouver, British Columbia.
It's
She
a long way.
joined it's a 4-day journey. And she joined a small ice skating troupe there. And they toured the West Coast. They went down into Mexico City, came back up into Hollywood, where she appeared in a couple of ice skating movies, which were the rage at the time. And I've got one of them, and I use that as part of a presentation I often do. It was a movie called Lady Let's Dance. And it was just amazing to see it the first time, to see my mother at the age of 18 go skating by in costume.
Who was it that was
And
the big skate? Was it Sonia
it was
Henke?
Sonia Henney
Henke.
was the big star. She was the highest paid star in Hollywood at the time.
Wow.
The movies my mother was in were with a woman named Belita, and
Oh, that's glamorous.
she came from the UK, and she was to be the answer to Sonia Henney, and just didn't have the publicity machine behind her. But she was a superior dancer and a superior ice skater to
I'll have
Sonia.
to look her up.
Yeah, she was quite a character. But the movie's called Lady Let's Dance. But over a period of time, my mother's career ascended, and she became more and more sought after as a performer. Ultimately, she wound up in San Francisco in the summer of 1947 with a group called Ice Follies. And Ice Follies toured the United States all year from starting in September. And they would end their tour there in June. And then they would spend the summer there, and they would rehearse their coming year's show during the day. At night, they would then perform for paying crowds. And during the summer of 1947, she apparently wound up in a summer romance, and left San Francisco, and probably in October realized she was pregnant. She continued to perform into January of 1948, at which time she returned to New York City, and she told nobody other than her eldest sister and her sister's husband that she was pregnant.
Wow.
And she was fortunate in that, given her celebrity, she had the resources to sort of sequester herself in a sublet apartment. and then managed her medical care and managed the birth and managed the adoption. And the only people who ever knew were the sister and the brother-in-law. And I've been very fortunate in meeting three cousins now, as a matter of fact, corresponded with still a fourth. And my question to each one of them has been, what did you know about my birth? And all of them just shook their head no and said, no one ever knew anything. And if in our family, if one person knew, everybody would have known.
Okay.
So
what a burden for her to keep all to herself. Yeah.
It was a very secretive process. And I think probably that weighed on her as well. It was a close-knit family with whom she had to be, I guess, for lack of other word, dishonest for a period of time as she went through this process.
Oh, well, it's like it sounds amazing because you've got romance, you've got drama and intrigue, and then you've got the glamour of Hollywood and the sort of post-war period in America. So it's got a little bit of everything going on. I'm sure people will be excited to read it. Where can they find out more about it?
Well, the book can be ordered from my website in the US. Unfortunately, to ship overseas, the cost is just prohibitive.
Okay.
But yeah,
so
the website is.
Can people from outside the States purchase it anywhere?
It's available through Amazon, as I believe everything is. Kobo also carries the book as well. So if you're in a company served by Kobo, you can order through them.
Fantastic.
And it's available in ebook format as well. So it can certainly be downloaded either off my website or from any of your favorite retailers.
Brilliant. Well, I'll certainly put a link to your website so people can find it. And have you any desire to write another memoir about something else, or even in some fiction, or do you feel that you've done what you were called to do?
No, actually, this has sort of opened up another door. As I said, after my birth, my mother had a very impressive career, both ice skating and then later in life as a businesswoman along with her husband. So I'm working on a piece right now which takes my birth mother from the time she surrendered me through the time that she found out she was pregnant with her first child by her recently married husband. So that's a period of 1948 until late 1955.
All right. So watch the space. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a story there. I've had a couple of false starts with it, but I think I'm onto a good track at this point. And, I want to tell her story. I think I can give some support to other birth mothers. And I think it also gives me the opportunity to go back out and socialize some more.
Lovely. Well, Edward, it's been fascinating learning about your writing, your history, and then, of course, your mother and her amazing career as well. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I've enjoyed the conversation.
If you're a first-time novelist who is struggling to either finish your novel or get those revisions to where you want them to be, then I've got just the thing for you. I have a small group coaching program which runs over 12 months, and over the course of that program I will help you fix those plot problems that you've been struggling with. I'll help you get under the surface of your characters so you really get to know them and what's driving them. And crucially for you, I give you that self-belief that you need to get you through the roller coaster that is writing a novel so that you can carry on, get to the end and get your book, your story out into the world so it can change people's lives. If that sounds good to you, if that is something that you'd be interested in doing, I know I can help you get to where you want to be. So book a call with me. Let's have a chat and see if we are a good fit for each other. If you're interested in doing that, then go to emmadesi.com/story builder. I look forward to chatting. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget, to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers, hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.